Okay, so now let's talk about our cost curves and our profit. We're going to see how using our rule of price equals marginal cost can tell us whether or not we're going to make profit in a particular industry. Okay, now the way we do that is I've recreated our cost curves from chapter 6, okay, from week 3. I put them on the board. We have our marginal cost curve, our average variable cost curve, and our average total cost curve, okay? Now, let's just draw a diagram. Let's just draw one demand curve for an individual producer, okay? Because remember, these are the cost curves for any given individual producer. We assume that all producers have the same cost curves. So therefore, since all producers have the same cost curves, let's look at what the demand curve looks like for any given individual producer. So let's say that that perfectly elastic demand curve looks like this. Just, assume it looks like this. Okay? And I wrote a D0 for demand 1. Okay? Well, here we have this price and this quantity. And before, we said that by having a price that's you should produce, I'll even write that on the board for you. Okay? In order to maximize your profit, you produce output, produce Q, until price is equal to marginal cost. Okay? So let's say that this is the demand curve facing any given individual producer, right? He produces corn, he produces lemonade, whatever. That's the demand curve facing him, okay, or her. Well, how does he maximize his profit? Okay? He or she maximizes their profit not by producing 1 unit, not by producing 2 units, or 3 units. They're going to be able to make profit. They're going to maximize their profit by producing quantity until price is equal to marginal cost. So this is price, this is marginal cost. That is where they should produce. They should produce 4 units of whatever it is they produce. Lemonade, corn, water bottles, things like that. Okay? That's how they make profit. How do we know they're making profit? Well, before we even get to how do we know, we use the golden rule, right? The golden rule for perfect competition is that price is equal to marginal cost. Okay? That's how you maximize your profit. You will make the most profit if you produce output until your price is equal to your marginal cost. So in the morning, you open up the newspaper, you look at the price, and you're going to make output until that price is equal to your marginal costs. Okay? So, at a price of 1, marginal cost, this was the price, right? If the quantity was 1, this is your marginal cost, this is your price, and that's your marginal cost. They're not equal. Price is greater than marginal cost. So that's not going to maximize your profit. Okay? Here, at 2 units, that's marginal cost, and that's price. Right? If you remember, since price is equal to marginal revenue is still greater than marginal cost. so therefore you can get more profit if you continue to produce more. At 3 units, whoops, marginal cost is still less than price. Okay? So, doesn't make sense to produce 3 units, right? You could still make more profit if you would produce a 4th unit. At 4 units, this is marginal cost, and that's price, or marginal revenue. Since price is equal to marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, then you know from this rule that you're maximizing your profits at 4 units. Okay, so you should produce 4 gallons of lemonade, or 4 water bottles, or 4 units of corn. Okay, things like that. How do we know you're making profit? Okay, well, at 4 units, let's try this with the red marker. At 4 units of output, this is your average total cost. Okay? At 4 units of output, that's your average total cost. But this is the price that you are earning for each unit, right? For the first unit, you got that price. The second unit, you got that price. The third unit, you got that price. And the 4th unit, you received that price, okay? So your marginal revenue is up here, because marginal revenue is equal to price. So your marginal revenue is up here, but your average total cost is right here. What is price and marginal revenue also equal to? It's equal to average revenue, right? If you remember all the way back, right, about half hour ago, I said that price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to average revenue. So if your average revenue is up here, and your average total cost is down here, that means on average, your revenue is greater than your costs, okay? On average, per unit, the amount of money you took in is greater than the amount of money you had to shell out. This is, and sometimes students get confused at this point, this is different from how you maximize total profit, okay? Total profit has already been maximized, okay? This is the maximization of your total profit. You're getting as much profit as you can. That would be this whole area, okay? But now what we're talking about is how do we know you're making profit? Well, because we made 4 units of corn, and on average, we received $1 for each unit of corn. But on average, it only cost us, say, 50 cents to produce each unit. Therefore, since $1 per unit we're taking in, and per unit we're only shelling out 50 cents, that's a pretty good sign that we're making profit. I mean, in fact, it means we're making profit, okay? So we know we're making profit because our average revenue, or our price, which is one and the same thing, price and average revenue, is greater than the average total cost, okay? So this is a profitable situation. This farmer, or this lemonade stand, is making profit if the price is that high, okay? So in other words, they opened up the newspaper and they went, ooh, hey, corn's selling for $1 today. I think I might make some profit. And in fact, I am making profit. I'm going to maximize my profits at 4 units of corn, and I know I'm making profit because my average revenue is greater than my average total costs, okay? Okay. Now, let's look at a situation where the firm is losing money. Okay? If the firm is losing money, if this is the demand curve they face. Okay? You're going to lose money if that's the demand curve you're facing. Why? Well, your average revenue is right here. Right? It's at this level. But this is your average variable cost. Right there. Okay? That's your average variable cost. So, let's say that on average, right, remember price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to average revenue, in perfect competition. If your marginal, or if your average revenue is less than your average variable costs, that means you're not even making enough to cover the cost of your labor. Okay? Forget about you making a profit. You're not even making enough money to pay your workers. Okay? Let's say that your average variable costs are 25 cents, right? So let's say that per unit of water bottle, right? For every water bottle that you make, it's on average, it costs you 25 cents to pay your labor. Okay? So let's say it costs 25 cents to pay your labor per water bottle. That would be your average variable cost. Well, let's say that you wake up in the morning, you open up your paper, since you're a price taker, and you say, oh no, right? Water bottles today are only going for 15 cents. Okay? Well, that would be a big problem, right? Because your 15 cents for the water bottles, right? Your average revenue, on average, you're only going to make 15 cents per water bottle. Your average revenue is less than your average variable costs. So, it doesn't matter how many water bottles you sell, you're never even going to be able to cover the amount of the cost of your labor. Okay? So, what you end up getting is a situation that we can build up to called this. If the price went up a little bit and went to here, you still wouldn't be able to cover the cost of your labor. Okay? You would not be able to, and so you wouldn't produce, right? If you can't produce, if you can't cover the cost of your workers, right? If you won't even be able to pay your workers, it doesn't make sense to produce at all. So you won't produce. You will produce nothing, right? Frankly, that's what you call going out of business. If you can't pay your labor, then you can't produce, so you don't make anything. If you don't make anything, right, if you stop making things, that's called going out of business. Okay? This discussion allows us to reach a conclusion where we call or reach a point that we call the shutdown point. The shutdown point is where the price, okay, it's where the demand curve, where the price and your average revenue is equal to the average variable costs. And this is on page 160, well, it starts on 161 and it goes all the way to 164, okay? But if this was your demand curve, this would be your average revenue, and that would be your average variable cost. When price is equal to the average variable cost, we call that the shutdown point. Okay? Why do we call it the shutdown point? Because anything below that on the marginal cost curve, right? Or sorry, anything below that on the average variable cost won't even cover the cost of our labor. Okay? If there was a price lower than this, then that price would be below our average variable costs, which means we wouldn't be able to pay our workers. Okay? So the shutdown point is where price is equal to average revenue, which is always true in perfect competition. But the shutdown point is where price is equal to average revenue, which is equal to average variable costs. Okay? So anything below any price, or if the demand curve was to go lower, then that price, if we had a demand curve lower, that price would be lower than the average variable cost, which means you wouldn't even be able to pay the cost of your labor. Forget about you yourself making a profit. It's just that you would not even be able to cover the cost of your workers, right? Because on average, it costs you 15 cents. You have to pay your workers 15 cents to make this water bottle. But if each water bottle is selling for 10 cents, right? Well, you get 10 cents per water bottle. That's your average revenue. But you're paying out 15 cents to your workers. So you yourself are losing money. Since you're losing money, it doesn't make any sense to produce, so you call that the shutdown point. Okay? Okay? The shutdown point is where price is equal to average revenue, which is equal to average variable cost. Anything below this, it doesn't make sense to produce. You will start producing when the average revenue, when the price is equal to average revenue, which is equal to average variable cost. You will produce then. Why would you produce then? Well, okay, let's say that the price has gone up from 10 cents to 15 cents. Okay, so for every water bottle I sell, I'm making 15 cents. Okay, that's my average revenue per water bottle. So it's 15 cents in, 15 cents out to pay my workers, right? The average variable costs. So 15 cents in, 15 cents out. If I was making 14 cents, then I would shut down. Right? So anything below your average variable cost, right? Anything, if this was below your average variable cost, you would shut down. So we call that the shutdown point, which is right here. Okay? And it is point, on page 164, it's point B. Okay? Finally, so we've looked at profit, right? We've looked at a situation where you get profit. That's when your price, your average revenue, that's when you get a demand curve That's way up here, when your average revenue is greater than your average total cost, or is greater than your average total costs. On the other hand, we saw that the shutdown point is when you are losing money. Okay, it makes sense to shut down and not produce anymore. Okay, why? Because if your price, if the demand curve is below your average variable costs, then you're going to be losing money. So it doesn't make sense to be producing anything, right? You're getting 13 cents in, but you have to pay 15 cents out. You're losing money, so you shut down, okay? The third situation we have to look at is point D. Point D on page 164. And on page 164, it shows you the break-even point. The break-even point is where the price, or the demand curve, cuts across the average total cost. Okay? We call it the break-even point because you are breaking even, okay? Here, at this price, you're making enough to cover your labor costs, right? You're making enough to cover your average variable costs. You're above the shutdown point, so you can pay your workers. But now, since it's equal to average total cost, you can also pay all of your fixed costs, okay? So you have a break, so you're breaking even, okay? Remember, average total cost is simply the sum of average variable and average fixed costs, okay? So, what you end up getting here, in this situation, price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to average revenue, right? Your average revenue is equal to your average total costs. You're breaking even, right? Let's say that on average you get 30 cents per water bottle, right? So you're pulling in 30 cents. The price of, you sit down in the morning, you open up the paper, okay, water bottles are going for 30 cents today. Okay, so on average you're pulling in 30 cents per water bottle, okay? And your average total cost, the sum of your labor costs and your fixed costs, is also 30 cents. So you're pulling in 30 cents, but you have to pay out 30 cents. So you're breaking even, hence the break-even point. Note, this is different from the shutdown point. At the shutdown point, you can just afford to pay your labor, okay? At the shutdown point, you can just afford to pay the average variable costs. At the break-even, so there's nothing left over for you or for your average fixed costs, okay? At the break-even point, you can just afford to, at the break-even point, you're making just enough, right? You're pulling in enough as a company where you can just afford to pay your labor, your average variable costs, and you can just afford to pay your average fixed costs, okay? The combination of those is the average total cost, okay? So you can afford to pay your labor and you can afford to pay your electricity bill, right? Your electricity is the average fixed cost, your labor is the average variable costs. The combination of those two, average total cost. Here, right, at the break-even point, you're making just enough per unit to where the average revenue coming in is just equal to the amount you have to pay out for your average total costs, right? It's for your labor and it's for the electricity bill, okay? So that's the break-even point. Unfortunately for you, the business owner, you're breaking even, right? There's nothing left over for you. You had to pay the electricity bill, which is the average fixed cost, and you had to pay the workers, which is the average variable costs. There's nothing left over for you. You only get to make profit if the price is higher than the average total cost curve. Okay? If the price is higher than the average total cost curve, then you will make profit. Okay? Which in the long run goes away. We'll see in a second, which is why this is highly questionable. But for now, you get to make profit if you have a demand curve like the first one that we went over. Okay? You will make profit if this is your demand curve, right? Because this will be your price. Okay? If this was your demand curve, then your average revenue would be up here, and your average total cost would be down there. So that difference would be profit. You will make profit if the price is greater than the average total cost. Okay? But for now, let's just write break even on the board. Okay? And the break-even point, as I mentioned, is when price is equal to average total cost. Right here. Okay? When price is equal to average total cost, then you will be breaking even. You're making just enough per unit of output. Okay? So for every water bottle you sell, you're making 30 cents in average revenue, but you have to pay out 30 cents in your average total costs, right? Which is the sum of your average fixed costs and average variable costs. Okay? So, this is profitable. This is where you'll be making profit. We could even write that out too. P1, P0. Okay? At P0, or this demand curve, at that demand curve, you're making profit. At this demand curve, you're breaking even. Whoops. And at P2 or D2, you have to shut down, okay? Because anything below this point, you can't even afford to pay your labor, okay? So these are the three really important points that we can talk about in perfect competition, okay? In perfect competition, the 3 points that really matter are profit, okay? You get profit when, and put up there, when price is equal to marginal cost. That's how you maximize it, but it'll be profitable if your price is greater than the average total revenue, okay? Okay? Let me make sure you can see all the way to the right of the diagram. So in the first example, you will make profit if your price is greater than the average total cost. If your price is greater than the average total cost, you're making profit. You're breaking even, okay? You break even if the price is equal to the average total cost. if the price is equal to the average total cost. Okay? Finally, you're at the shutdown point if the price is equal to your average variable costs. Okay? So, just to recap really briefly, why is this? If you're at the first point, P0, if your price is higher than the average total costs, right? Price is always equal to marginal revenue in perfect competition. Okay? In monopoly, that changes. But in perfect competition, if price is greater, since price is equal to marginal revenue, which is equal to average revenue, if your average revenue, the amount you're making per unit, is greater than the amount you have to pay out, okay, well, then what you end up doing is you're making profit. The total amount you have to pay out, if the amount you make per unit is greater than the total amount you have to pay out on average, you're making profit. On the other hand, second, if the price is equal to, if the price is P1, if that price is equal to your average total revenue, or your average total cost, then your average revenue, the amount you're taking in, is just enough to cover the sum of your average fixed cost and your average variable costs, okay? So that average revenue just meets your average total costs, okay? So at that point you're breaking even. You're not making profit, but you're always breaking even. Finally, you have D2 or P2, the shutdown point, okay? Where you would not be producing beneath, okay? At this point, you're making just enough to where your where the average revenue is just equal to the amount you have to pay out for your labor, okay? So that's just covering your labor costs, okay? Anything beneath that, you want to shut down, okay? Now, with all of this, we can derive the supply curve, okay? The short-run supply curve, which you've seen before. In Chapter 3, it's the upward sloping supply curve, okay? And I mentioned that one of these curves is going to become the supply curve. Okay, let's see which one. And this is out of the discussion in the diagram on page 163 and 164. Okay? Okay. What I've done on the board for now is I've drawn, and I hope this comes across in the video medium. It's usually a lot easier to do this in person, I think. I've drawn the marginal cost curve with the average total cost curve and the average variable cost curve. Okay? I've also just made a dot at the shutdown point and at the break-even point, okay? As it turned out, we also need to remember, if you want to maximize your profits, remember the golden rule of perfect competition. In order to maximize profit, you produce output until price is equal to marginal cost, okay? So the price will be equal to marginal cost. Here though, right, let's say you had this price. At this price, you're below the shutdown point, so you won't produce there, okay? If you're below the shutdown point, remember, your average revenue is less than your average variable costs, right? You're making 10 cents per water bottle, but you have to pay labor 15. So for every water bottle, you're losing 5 cents, okay? It doesn't make sense to produce. You shut down, the firm has gone out of business. So, this portion of price, being equal to marginal cost, that portion of price being equal to marginal cost, that marginal cost portion, that portion of the curve, does not exist, really, because you're not going to produce there. Okay? Why wouldn't you produce here? Sure, if you wanted to maximize your profits, you set price equal to marginal cost, right? You wake up in the morning, you open up the newspaper, and it says, water bottles, 10 cents. You go, that's lower than my average variable costs. That's below, right? So my average revenue is below my average variable costs. I'm at the shutdown point, right? I'm below the shutdown point. I'm down here. So even though if I wanted to maximize my profit, I would produce output until price is equal to marginal cost. Well, okay, price equal to marginal cost right here, but I'm beneath the shutdown point. So this portion of the marginal cost curve becomes irrelevant, right? You're never going to produce below the shutdown point. That's why it's called the shutdown point. You would never produce beneath it. So, that portion of the marginal cost curve doesn't really exist, which I'm just going to draw as a hyphen. Okay? I'm going to draw it as a dashed line. I should take that back. It does exist, but you're never going to produce there, right? Because you're below the shutdown point. As it turns out, the marginal cost curve above the shutdown point, well, the shutdown point and above, okay, so here and above, that is the supply curve, okay? So if you remember, from chapter 3 when we did supply and demand, you had a supply curve. The supply curve gets its shape from the marginal cost curve. The marginal cost curve is the market supply curve. Okay? What you do is you take every single firm's marginal cost curves above the shutdown point, and if you add them all together, you get the supply curve. Because here we have price and a quantity. As the quantity goes up, or the law of supply, as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. Well, here, if we just label the axes, this is a price, this is a quantity. As price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up as well. Okay? That is as long as the price is above the shutdown point. Okay? So if the price is equal to or greater than the average variable costs, then you'll have the supply curve. So this marginal cost curve is actually, as it turns out, the supply curve. Or if you want to look at it the other way, the supply curve is actually the marginal cost curve. Okay? So, we can really start thinking about this now. Let's tie together chapters 6 and 7. Well, but even before we get to that, let's just follow our golden rule. Maximize profit, produce Q until price is equal to marginal cost. If this is the price, then that will be our quantity supplied, right? If this was the price, this would be the quantity supplied. If this was the price, this would be our quantity supplied. So as you can see, what I'm trying to do here is derive the supply curve for you. We have a price. Well, let's do that one. We have a price and a quantity. 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 As you can see, what that turns into is the supply curve. I'm just going to check to see if it's not too messy for you. So the marginal cost curve becomes the supply curve because as long as you set the price equal to the marginal cost above the shutdown point, you get price and quantity relationships. And as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up, while we are maximizing our profits. Okay? So, and I'm just going to draw a little circle here for our shutdown point. Okay? This is our marginal cost / supply curve. Okay? The dashed portion represents places on the points on the marginal cost curve that we would not produce at. They're below the shutdown point, so therefore you wouldn't produce at them. Okay? But they are still a portion of the marginal cost curve. Okay? So this is where the supply curve begins. This is your supply curve. But this is the marginal cost curve. Okay? So, here we go. Where does the supply curve get its shape from? Well, the supply curve gets its shape from the marginal cost curve, right? They're one and the same. Okay? The marginal cost curve turns into the supply curve. Well, okay, where does the marginal cost curve get its shape from? Okay? The answer to that we saw back in chapter 6 is this diagram. The marginal cost curve gets its shape from the total product, marginal product diagram that we saw, right? Where you have increasing returns, increasing marginal returns at the beginning, then you have diminishing marginal returns here, okay? If you remember, in that diagram, I'll find you the page if you want to refer back to it. The diagram is on page 136 if you just want to refer back to it briefly, okay? But you have increasing marginal returns here, which is why your marginal cost curve slopes downwards, and then here, for the rest of the diagram, you have diminishing marginal returns, which is why your marginal cost curve slopes upwards. Okay? If you remember the diminishing returns discussion, it's because you have too many cooks in the kitchen. Okay, so in order to get more output, in order to get the same amount of output, you have to pay more, right? So your marginal costs are going up. Okay? Here is where we're going with this. The supply curve is actually the marginal cost curve. Okay? Well, where does the marginal cost curve get its shape from? The marginal cost curve gets its shape from diminishing returns. Okay? It gets it from the law of diminishing returns. If there is no law of diminishing returns, then you don't get an upward sloping marginal cost curve. And if you don't get an upward sloping marginal cost curve, then you don't get an upward sloping supply curve. Okay? Now, the only way to get the law of diminishing returns is we have to talk about marginal products. And if you remember on page 136, there it is, where we're talking about marginal products, okay? Where you're looking at how much additional product, how much additional quantity will each additional unit of input generate, okay? So in other words, if you hire one more worker, how much output will they produce? What's their marginal product, okay? So we said diminishing returns is more or less diminishing marginal products, right? As you hire more and more workers, there's more cooks in the kitchen, so they can't do as much, so their marginal products go down, okay? So ultimately, and this is going to be the last portion where we put these two together, it is diminishing marginal products, or declining marginal products, that leads to diminishing returns, okay? So in other words, it's each worker becoming less and less productive as you add another worker, right? There's too many cooks in the kitchen. Diminishing marginal product leads to diminishing returns, and diminishing returns leads to an upward sloping marginal cost curve, and the upward sloping marginal cost curve leads to an upward sloping supply curve, okay? Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, if it turns out that there's no such thing as marginal products, okay? If it turns out that marginal products don't exist, then you don't have diminishing returns. And if you don't have diminishing returns, you can't make a marginal cost curve. And if you can't make an upward sloping marginal cost curve, you don't get an upward sloping supply curve, okay? So basically what I'm trying to tie together for you is this concept that if there's no such thing as marginal products, you can't get an upward sloping supply curve, okay? Why even bring that up? Well, it turns out there was a debate in the 50s and 60s called the Cambridge Capital Controversies, where they did exactly that. A bunch of heterodox economists, and I mentioned in the first lesson about Piero Sraffa, one of Keynes's friends, S-R-A-F-F-A, okay? Piero Sraffa created the Cambridge Capital Controversies, where the heterodox economists went up against the orthodox economists. It's called the Cambridge Controversies because Sraffa was in Cambridge, England, and a man named Robert Solow and Paul Samuelson were in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT. And Sraffa said, hey look, there's no such thing as marginal products, which means you don't have diminishing marginal returns, which means there's no such thing as a marginal cost curve, which means there's no such thing as an upward sloping supply curve. That's a big issue for neoclassical economics, right? Because the whole point of neoclassical economics is that there's an upward sloping supply curve, there's a downward sloping demand curve, and they will adjust to reach equilibrium on their own, and therefore capitalism has a self-adjusting mechanism, right? That's what neoclassicals say. There's an upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, these things will adjust to reach equilibrium, and therefore capitalism is socially harmonious because the market will always produce equilibrium. Well, okay, Sraffa comes along and says, well, if there's no such thing as a marginal product, then that means, and he proved decisively there's no such thing as a marginal product, then, and he used a very long mathematical argument, which if you want you can email me for, but it's very, very, very complicated, okay? If you want to come to my office, I'd be more than happy to explain it to you. But it's not an intro level thing at all. So you sort of have to trust me on this one. He said if there's no such thing as a marginal product, there's no such thing as diminishing marginal returns, which means there's no such thing as an upward slope, or no such thing as a marginal cost curve, which means there's no such thing as an upward sloping supply curve, which means that this whole self-adjusting mechanism that neoclassical economists keep talking about does not exist. Okay? That is what Sraffa ultimately said. That's why his work is so incredibly important. Now, how did this all turn out? Cambridge, Massachusetts. The MIT guys at Cambridge, Massachusetts, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow, admitted to Sraffa and Joan Robinson in Cambridge, England. The guys at MIT admitted to Cambridge, England that Cambridge, England was correct. Okay? Samuelson and Solow, who were both neoclassical economists, admitted neoclassical economics was wrong. Okay? So what happened? Why is this stuff still being taught, right? Which I have to teach it to you, or else I put you at an enormous disadvantage, okay? Because everyone else in economics these days is still being taught this. So I had to teach that to you. But why is this still being taught? Well, a lot of neoclassical economists decided to just sweep it under the rug, okay? There's a famous quote by a Duke University professor named Charles Ferguson, who wrote, right after the Cambridge Capital Controversies occurred, he wrote in the foreword to his book, I am aware of the results, he was a neoclassical economist, and he wrote in the foreword to his book, I am aware of the Cambridge Capital Controversies and their outcomes and its implication for neoclassical economics. Unfortunately, for academia, something like that. I've dedicated 40 years of my life to neoclassical economics, and I will continue to do so despite its logical fallacies. That is academic dishonesty. That's like finding out that the law of gravity is wrong, but still sticking with the law of gravity. Okay? It's academic dishonesty. So, when people always wonder, and just to tie it back around to current day events, why isn't the economy getting better? Shouldn't the markets be adjusting? Well, it turns out there is no self-adjusting mechanism in capitalism. It's just that we've chosen to ignore that for the last 55, 60 years. Okay? Now, we're going to take another break, and we'll come back to this a little bit down the road. Okay? But we're going to take a break for right now, then we're going to talk about perfect competition in the long run. Okay?